Hi, my name is Kara Hamley O'Donnell, and I am the Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Cleveland Heights. This building that you're in is owned and operated by the City of Cleveland Heights. Tonight, the lecture is presented by the Cleveland Heights Landmark Commission and the Cleveland Heights Historical Society, who work to put on a few of these presentations every few months right here at the schoolhouse. I see some new faces, so welcome, and afterwards, if you'd like to go upstairs and check out the upstairs of this building, it's sort of our archival area and is always in a state of trying to get everything that gets donated categorized and logged in, but it's interesting to check out. If you might have noticed, the restrooms are by the back door when you came in. And I wanted to point out two more lectures that we'll be presenting here. And at the end, we'll have snacks over there, and there's copies of the Historical Society's most recent newsletter. These are always very fascinating, and you can get these mailed to your door if you're a member of the Historical Society. But there are two lectures coming up on about almost exactly a month from today. On Thursday, September 27th, we'll have a lecture by Marion Morton, who's in the audience tonight, called Barometers of Change, Congregations and Houses of Worship in Cleveland Heights. And then on Sunday, November 4th, the Cleveland Heights Historical Society will have its annual fundraiser at Judson, and the title of that is Classical Music in Cleveland, the Cleveland Heights Connection, and the speaker, Klaus G. Roy, is also in our audience this evening. So if you're interested in any of those, they're in the front cover under the Save the Date. And this article is very fascinating too, so it's worth a read. And near the front door, there's also some back copies of the Historical Society's newsletter, so if you're interested, pick that up. On to tonight's business. Sabine Kretzschmar is the executive director of the Shaker Historical Society and Museum. She has a master's degree in art history and museum studies from Case Western Reserve University and has 20 years of museum and nonprofit experience, curatorial, education, and development positions. She has worked at the Cleveland Museum of Art, Akron Art Museum, University of Akron, and WCPN, WVIZ Idea Stream, and I think we're all interested to hear what she has to say about the Shaker Lakes.
Hi there. By a show of hands, how many people have been to the Shaker Historical Society? Okay, I'm really impressed. This is really good. I do have brochures and upcoming programs of the Shaker Historical Society on the table over there, so pick them up if you want to see what's going on. Tonight I'm speaking about the Shaker Lakes. I admit this talk has a slight slant towards Shaker Lakes as it pertains to Shaker Heights, based on the collection and what I was working with, but it certainly is our shared property, so to speak, and I think is a bit broader than all of that. I'm not from the area originally. I moved here about 20 years ago, and I was told by people immediately that I needed to live in Cleveland Heights, which I did. I moved to Grandview, which is probably what everybody does. And I was told that I have to go check out the Shaker Lakes. I had lived by very big bodies of water and did not, admittedly, understand why everyone was so passionate about the Shaker Lakes at that point in time. 20 years later, here I have devoted just quite a bit of time and research, and you know, the Shaker Lakes are an integral part of my career, so I do get it now, and again, hope to share some of that with you. I want to start with a quote by Herb Asherman, the photographer who grew up in Shaker Heights. He had a recollection about growing up and said, "The Shaker Lakes had a great deal of impact on us, on children. I never related to the lake downtown," and I think that really very much applies to the Shaker Lakes themselves. So, first slide. What are we talking about? Aerial view from 1961. What you see sort of in the center, you have Lower Shaker Lake, Upper Shaker Lake, and then you've got right here and here, Green Lake and Marshall Lake. Lower Shaker Lake was created, it's the oldest of the lakes. It was created in 1836. Upper Shaker Lake, 1852. Green and Marshall were both created in 1911. Green Lake was named for Fred Green. He was a real estate man in Shaker Heights, worked for the Van Swearingen Company, helped develop it. And Marshall for George Marshall, who owned Marshall Drugs and had a very large mansion that's currently being renovated, which should be quite spectacular when it's finished, right on Lee Road. Lower Shaker Lake almost always has been called Lower Shaker Lake. In one map, it's called West Lake, but otherwise it's mostly Lower Shaker Lake. Upper Shaker Lake has had a series of names. It's been called Hampton Lake after one of the Shakers who lived there towards the very end. It's been called Hiawatha. It's been called Crescent. I think that's about it, but it's had quite a few different names. Next slide, please. Okay, you cannot think of the Shaker Lakes without thinking of the whole Doan Brook watershed, which you see here. The Doan Brook has 2 branches, and that's exactly, Doan Brook was dammed 4 times to create these 4 lakes. And it meanders all the way through University Circle, as you all know, adjacent to Martin Luther King, and lets out right where Gordon Park meets Lake Erie. Next slide. It all begins with the North Union Shakers. Next slide. They're the ones who actually made the first 2 lakes. Okay, here we have Ralph Russell left, Laura Russell right. They are the very first 2 Shakers in this region. They came to this part of the country in 1812. Warrensville Township was first settled in 1808, so they were pretty new. They actually came to forested land. They had to cut all the timber. They labored the land as farmers. They had their brothers, or rather the Russell brothers, had land adjacent. And by about 1822, Ralph takes a little hike down to southern Ohio in Dayton. He visits Union Village, a Shaker community there. And has a spiritual awakening and is convinced to start a Shaker colony in what is Shaker Heights, in Warrensville Township. He walks back, he sees a burning bush, just like Moses. He's sure in his convictions, comes home, Laura, we are going to now live as Shakers. Our 3 children are no longer going to be considered, live in the same home. We're not going to live as a family. We are not going to live as husband and wife. The Shaker order is a celibate one. We believe in the confession of sins now, and we are going to embark this. And he managed actually to convince his brothers. There was a whole group of at least 20 people initially who became Shakers. They all gave up their land and all of their possessions. They were jointly owned by the United Society of Believers, as Shakers were known. And eventually the community grew to anywhere from 200 to 300, depending on what you read. And it thrived up until about the Civil War. The numbers really started to decrease after that, and the community disbanded in 1889. There were 27 remaining Shakers at that point. They sold the land and their possessions and relocated to other Shaker communities. There were 23 communities nationwide, and so not very many. And so we have, again, this legacy here, which was actually not just current-day Shaker Heights, but also part of Cleveland Heights. Next slide, please. Okay, this is about the first map we know of the Shaker community. This is dated 1834, hand-drawn map. What you have here, Center Road then, Lee Road now, okay? This would be South Woodland, and this would be Fairmont up here. The Center family, here's Doan Brook, the 2 branches here and here. Center family located primarily around here. The family house was here, the meeting house, all on either side of Lee Road. That would pretty much be between what is now sort of South Park, and it would continue south of Shaker Boulevard. Here, the East family, or called the School family, is to the right. They were in charge of the children. Shakers were celibate, but they had a lot of children, not only from families, but also they took in orphans. They were really a social service organization of their day, believed in total equality in terms of race, gender. and believed in serving fellow man, so we had quite a few children at that point. And then at the upper left is what's known as the Mill family, or the North family. They had and were sort of the caretakers of the main Shaker mills. By this time in 34, there were small sawmills and grist mills located, but as you can tell, no lakes yet. Next slide. Okay, 1874. So you get a much better idea of how the community has grown. We now have both the lakes fully functioning. Horseshoe or lower, or horseshoe or upper and lower over here. One mill here, and the grist mill is here. That's located roughly where Kemper meets Fairhill. So that's the location of where the grist mill was. The Shaker had all the land that you see here. By 1874, they had roughly 1,300, just under 1,400 acres of land. And when you look at this map, it gives you a really good indication how all of the land around there was parceled off in much smaller pieces. By holding this one large chunk of land in reserve, actually allowed for future developments under one large single real estate development company, the Van Sweringen Company. So in part, the fact that the urban planning that went on in Shaker Lakes and the southernmost part of Cleveland Heights is because the Shakers sort of held this all as one large entity. Next slide, please. Okay, more detailed map of the Center family, and this is kind of fun to keep in mind as you might wander around Shaker Lakes Park. Okay, they had huge apple orchards. This land, by the way, Shakers were farmers. The land was terrible for farming. They couldn't grow grain, so they turned very quickly to orchards and fruit. They had wine as well, a huge garden. And a lot of their enterprises were actually really through the mills. They needed the water power to create a lot of their wood products, brooms, pails. Their grist mill also brought in a great deal of money. Okay, so here you have Lee Road. South Park wasn't there at this time, but that's where it went in. Right here is the woolen mill. Okay, here's Horseshoe Lake. Shaker Historical Society is right here. If you walk across the street, you can actually even still see traces of this mill race in the ground. It looks a little like a mini canal. It's over here, and then the blacksmith shop would be there. The main meeting house would be here. Shaker Boulevard would be somewhere in here. And the main center, the main family house was here. Most of the supporting buildings. Cemetery was here. Cemetery was completely moved. The bones were all taken and removed. The Warrensville West Cemetery, which is on Lee Road by Heinens. And the stones, who knows where they went. We have one in our museum, but they were just scattered around. So that's, again, the Center family. Next slide, please. This is a picture, roughly the corner of Shaker Boulevard and Lee, looking north, okay? There's a dip here. This dip is where Doan Brook would be, and you're looking up towards Fairmont. Here's the main family house. This is the broom factory. And that's just an idea of what it looked like. Next slide. This is looking the other direction. Now you're standing roughly at the corner of South Park and Lee, looking south. Here's the family house again, the broom shop. This was the girls' house. Girls lived in one house, 13 and younger. Boys in another, 13 and younger. You had men and women in the family house, but they had separate doors and lived entirely on separate sides. The meeting house, the Shakers were an offshoot of the Quakers, and their religious services were like meetings, but unlike the Quakers, dance was a huge part of their religious service. And so the meeting house was just further down. This was the visitor's house and central office, and then a pasture in front. Next slide. This is the woolen mill. So this would have been almost across the street from where the Shaker Historical Society is. Pretty close, actually, to the intersection of Lee and South Park, and to the left is the blacksmith shop. This particular mill was built in 1854, 2 years after the lake itself was dammed, and it was 3 stories on one side, 4 on the other. And you have to really think of this mill not so much as this quaint little building, but really as a factory. On the top floor, there was a huge spinning jack with 150 spindles, 2 power looms for the production of cloth. On the next floor down, you had carding machines. They would take the wool. They had Bakewell sheep, known for their wool, and they actually make stockings out of it and knit all kinds of things. The next floor down was an iron lathe for broom handles. Broom production, the Shakers, by the way, invented the flat broom. I don't know if you know this. Brooms up until the time of the Shakers used to all be round. The Shakers invented the flat broom. They were incredibly inventive. It's not, we can't prove it, but North Union Shakers also supposedly invented the clothespin. I cannot find documentation for this. They didn't get patents, but that one I question a little bit, but they were really, unlike the Amish, they didn't shy away from technology. They created the rotary harrow. They created a waterproof material or substance that they put on fabric to have their clothes become more waterproof, a revolving oven, and many, many, many improvements in farm tools and kitchen implements. They really were incredibly creative. They're also, as you well know, the first people to put seeds in packets and envelopes and sell them commercially. They were really phenomenal agriculturalists. I will say, there were Shakers in Florida, and they had a colony right near Orlando. They took land that no one else could grow anything on and immediately grew huge crops of pineapples and oranges. Who knew, right? But the Shakers were really incredible growers is the point, and even down in Florida, they were known for their ability to really, really make things happen. In the basement, there was also a grindstone and a buzz saw that was only for fuel, for cutting wood for fuel. But that's what you found in this woolen mill. Next slide. Okay, this is from North Park, looking sort of southeast onto that central family again. Lee Road is right here. What would be South Park would be over here. Most of these pictures date to around 1900. By this time, the Shaker buildings had been abandoned and weren't in the greatest state of repair, but it's the only pictures we have for the most part. Next slide. This is the layout of the School family or East family, much smaller group. It's roughly where Fontenay Road is off of South Woodland. Next slide. This is their family house. In addition to the school, they were also known for growing silk. They had a bunch of mulberry trees, and they had a whole bunch of silkworms. And again, one of the kids' jobs was to take the silk from the mulberry trees and feed the silkworms was one of the kids' jobs. Next slide. And this is the Mill family. The grist mill, 3/4 of a mile approximately away from the dam of Shaker Lake. And as you'll notice, Doan Brook really only continues today along that southern kind of meandering path, but at that time, also the northern path was there, and that's exactly where you had the sawmill. Next slide. This is the Mill family itself, and on the far right, the biggest house is indeed the actual family house itself. And I guess that meandering road would roughly be what Coventry is. Next slide. And this is the Mill family on their front porch. Again, one of the very few pictures we have of the actual Shakers in a setting. Next slide. And this is Glenn Shaw, an artist's rendition based on photographs of the Mill family. This is that tributary. This is actually the mill itself, Upper Shaker Lake, the family house. Next slide. And this is the sawmill itself. Two-story sawmill. The foundations for this still survive. Have any of you seen these foundations on the corner of North Park and Coventry? Okay, they are still there. You wouldn't know it. You have to pull off right along the dam of Lower Shaker Lake and kind of walk in paths behind. I invite you to do it. It's pretty interesting. There's a few things back there that you might find surprising. It was one of the best sawmills. People who visited it said that it was one of the most efficient mills they had seen. And on the second floor, there was a cooper shop for the production of barrels, buckets, and the like. So again, all of these really are factories at a time before the Industrial Revolution had fully set into the Cleveland area, and they're producing goods not just for their community, but for the larger Cleveland community. And they'd go down to Doan's Corners and do commerce, and really they did quite well for a while until their numbers really started to drop. Next slide. This is sort of the crowning achievement. This is the 5-story stone grist mill. An amazing structure considered at the time to be the finest mill in Ohio. In the basement, the walls are roughly 4 feet thick, built out of Euclid bluestone. They are standing, these two people, this is from about 1876. Those two gentlemen are standing on a bridge that crossed Doan Brook. Today that area is heavily forested. You don't have that kind of open view of it. But if you go down Doan Brook, which is another interesting thing to do, and down the gorge, there's the cutaway for this mill. This mill would have been on the north side of Doan Brook, very close to North Park. Next slide. This is a picture of shakers actually in their quarry. There was a shaker quarry that part of it was out of Doan Brook, but do you know where Kemper Road is, where the Cleveland Skating Club is? It was quite a large quarry, and the shakers actually quarried all of the stone for this mill in 1844 by hand. By the 60s, 1862 or whatever, they actually had steam-powered machinery to quarry. But in any case, this mill was pretty much hand-built. It had a 50-foot drop in order to actually turn the water wheel. It's really a much more dramatic landscape through Doan Brook. If you haven't walked through it than you might expect. Next slide. And we have another picture. The shakers, we don't have a lot of information about what they thought about the lakes, how they used it, but we certainly know that cows would sit at its banks. This is James Prescott on the right, a profile with a school class. He would take his students outdoors, he'd do nature walks, he'd point out the various things that they'd see as they'd walk through, again, the woods, the birds, and that kind of thing. And so we do have an image of that. Next slide. And you have someone drinking water here along Doan Brook. But again, interesting to see what it looks like without the complete overgrowth that we have today. Again, 1876 is the date of this as well. All of these images, by the way, that I'm showing you that have this sort of vertical thing are all from a group of stereo views, of suburban views of Cleveland, Dudley Kozad's views by a landscape photographer named Udall. And I have one original. They're pretty much all lost. So if you ever see them, hold on to them and give them to a public institution. Next slide, please. Okay. Sadly, the shakers do leave in 1889. One of the real sort of symbols of their demise, next slide please, was in 1886. They sold off bits and pieces, some of their property before they actually sold off the 1,400 acres. And they sold the grist mill in 1886 to a guy named Charles Reeder. Charles Reeder wanted it for its stone. So what he decided to do is blow it up. What you're looking at here is the remains of the grist mill. But he didn't just blow it up. He decided to do it in style, and on July 4th, he created this extravaganza attended by 4,000 people. They set up a dining hall on site, actually, and that was operated by the ladies of the Euclid Avenue Methodist Church. There were lemonade vendors and dime vendors who sold all kinds of things for a dime. It was very clear there was no intoxicating liquor sold, and the crowd was very well behaved. There were 6 bands, okay, and the Cleveland Light Artillery did a salute. There was a sham battle to represent Bull Run, so they had a reenactment. They had a tightrope walker across Doan Gorge. They were going to have a hot air balloon, but the weather wouldn't support that. The winds were too high. There was a dancing pavilion erected, okay, so it was quite a thing. But 5 o'clock was the big deal, right? They had cut a lot of holes in the mill, and they had put in all the dynamite, and boom! and nothing happens. And this kind of went on over and over and over again. It finally fell, but it took a lot more dynamite, and they were very late into the night. This, you can see why this is very much sort of the symbolic end of the Shakers. But again, the Shaker Lakes really were for commerce more than anything. The other thing I will mention too, that I find this amazing, you know, like most 19th century farms, the Shakers harvested the ice on the lake every winter, and they'd pack it in their ice house with straw, and it would stay frozen until the summer, and of course they'd use that ice for all their refrigeration needs as well. So the lake really was for commerce and for utility. 1891, we have 1,363.5 acres sold to a guy named Lawrence Lamb of Memphis, Tennessee for $316,000. He turns around and sells this in 1892 to the Continental Land Company of Virginia for $400,000. So he makes a real quick profit. Next slide. Actually, this is one other view of the ruins of the grist mill. This is the dam. These are wooden, excuse me, I keep knocking this. These are wooden planks. The dam is broken and it comes through here. And the mill race came through here. It was actually carved out of the rock. And then it would dump out over the big wheel that was inside the actual grist mill. Next slide. And this is the ruins of the sawmill. And you can even see they're a bit higher than they are today, but you can see the big tall structure is the actual wheel that was left when this picture was taken. Next slide. Okay, Continental Land Company. They had the land for a pretty short period of time, so they purchased it in 1892. January of 1893, they want to develop it. By 1892 and 1893, when it was purchased, it really was ripe for some kind of suburban development. Cleveland had grown, Euclid Avenue was sort of waning, and the Heights were becoming sort of the place to build new residential communities. The only real problem, of course, is there was no good rapid transit. There was no good transit. The roads were really not great. I mean, there are reports of, I guess Mayfield was a plank road at that point, but there are reports of the mud roads that came up the Heights themselves. There weren't very many. Doan Brook was actually quite steep, quite difficult to get up. So the transportation wasn't great. Yet, speculators decided, well, let's buy this land and we'll eventually develop it. So, okay, this is the Continental Development Group's plan out of Virginia. They hire Nathan Barrett to do the landscape plan. Nathan Barrett is the landscape engineer, was his title here on this thing, of Pullman, Illinois, the company town that was designed for the workers. George Pullman hired Nathan to do that. He's also one of the founders of the American Society of Landscape Architects and has done numerous projects across the country, big wheels, so to speak. So this is what he decided to do. It's really quite different from what actually ended up happening. Okay, my favorite thing. See this? That actually is indicated as the spiral. It's located exactly where the Nature Center is. So the Nature Center could have been smack dab almost in the middle of a spiral. I have no idea what it's really meant to do or what its function is. It looks like a path that dead ends. If any of you have any better ideas what it might be, please let me know. Along the north side of Lower Shaker Lake, there's some hardscape. So presumably some walls, some patios, that kind of thing. You'll notice that other than maybe the roads right around the park and some existing, it's mostly a grid structure though. This is a gridded community. And there might be a boulevard here or there, but you know, pretty ordinary in terms at least of, you know, or at least, you know, what we think of in terms of suburban landscapes. Next slide. Here you see the spiral again on the left and their plans for East Lake, as they call it, or Horseshoe Lake, with, again, in the peninsula, some hardscape as well. That not too radically different from today. Well, this didn't come to pass, and actually they ended up selling the land later, about 6 months later even, in 1893 for a loss for $315,000. So for a loss of $85,000. 1893 were difficult times financially. Not a good time to develop land. No one had much luck. And it was purchased at that point by a group of Buffalo investors, the Shaker Heights Land Company, run by a guy named William Gratwick, who was a shipping magnate, and other people who were along William Rice and E.J. Blandon were other investors. And they were, again, sort of holding on to the land until something better came along. Next slide, please. The first thing they really wanted to do, and of course Rockefeller had his hand in all of this, was have better access to the Shaker Lakes and the lands around. So let's develop a park. It already was a great place for a Sunday drive, and in 1894, the Cleveland Board of Park Commissioners unveiled this plan. This is designed by Ernest Bowditch, who was an employee of Olmsted out of Boston. And this is his design, which was actually realized and fully unveiled in 1897. The next slide shows a detail. It was all, whoops, next slide. I don't know what happened to that. Oh well. Actually, go back a second. It is what it is today, really. You've got Horseshoe Lake here, you have Lower Shaker Lake here, and what this really does is lay out North and South Park pretty much as we have it today, at least as far as the Shaker Lakes are concerned. Next slide after the blank one. So, it's completed, the roads are there, and as you all know, the Shaker Heights Land Company donated 275 acres, J.D. Rockefeller gave 276 acres, and apparently convinced a lot of other people to give land, and the park finally was created. The thing that amazes me is Rockefeller Park was reportedly used by almost 44,000 people on a sunny afternoon in 1896. The usage this park got is just mind-boggling. And so here you have a horse and carriage going up, in this case, what would be sort of Cedar Hill. It's going underneath the railroads there. Next slide, please. And you'd ride up North and South Park Boulevard. Okay, this is, again, that same intersection of South Park and Lee Roads, and you're looking north. So by this time, a lot of the Shaker buildings are gone, and more will have gone in the subsequent years. Almost all the Shaker buildings were demolished between 1900 and 1905. They had been left sitting for many years. They were in pretty bad shape. The Shakers were able to rent a few, but that didn't go very far. So we really lament today that we don't have any Shaker buildings left whatsoever. The only remains of the Shakers are those foundations, a few gateposts, the dams themselves, and the lakes. But that's the way it is. Next slide, please. These are all from 1894, so right as the park's being developed, Upper Shaker Lake. Notice how few trees there really are. It really was quite sparse. We can thank the many people who planted trees over the years, I think, for the lush greenness we have around the lakes today. Next slide. Another from 1894. These are both Upper Shaker Lake. You can see it looking at the peninsula. Next slide. And this is Lower Shaker Lake. Next slide. This is the dam and the bridge at Lower Shaker Lake. Some people kind of wandering in the creek behind, which you can still do today pretty much in the same way with a different bridge. Next slide. And these are some people standing around the lower part of the dam at Upper Shaker Lake that the Shakers themselves had built. Next slide. A freak tree, as it's described, that's quoted from the actual description underneath the picture. But again, you take your picnic and you take your girlfriend and you go out for a Sunday drive. Next slide. And here you've got a couple women climbing up on the ruins of the old Shaker Mill. You get a little bit of an idea of the scale. Next slide. This is actually in Upper Shaker Lake. This is the drain. This is where the lake actually, it's still there today. Shaker created all of this. It's where the water from the lake drains down. to the lower portion of it. And then it was the mill race itself that carried the water to the mill, and then the elevation dropped once it got to the mill itself. Next slide. Here's where the Van Swerigens pretty much enter the picture, 1904. Ringel was one of several development companies that didn't quite fail, but the Van Swerigens actually were in connection with this, and right as this was being released is when the Van Swerigens came on the scene. But you'll notice pure air and water, you know, the lake. This is the frontispiece of their promotional piece. Live here, live near the lakes. It's clean, it's pure. You know, that's what you want. Next slide, please. So this is the plan they came up with, and this is in some ways the plan that the Van Swerigens ended up developing it. Oris Mantis James and Oris Paxton Van Swerigen. Brothers, they were 2 years apart. They went by MJ and OP. They hated their first names. They had an 8th grade education. They grew up near Doan's Corners in that area, and had a few failed real estate development ventures in Lakewood before they turned their sights to this whole Shaker Heights area. The first area they looked at was what is today Cleveland Heights. They convinced the Shaker Heights Land Company to give them just some plots, small chunks of land, and what they would do is sell it and use the profit to buy more land, because they really didn't have any money. The Shaker Heights Land Company was pretty desperate because whatever they were doing wasn't working. Rapid transit was still really the preeminent problem, and so this was sort of the plan. So the Van Swerigens are pretty much responsible for the area. Here you have Coventry, Fairmont, for this sort of developing this. This was their first main impetus from about 1905 to 1908. They worked on selling these various plots of land, and, you know, with moderate success. Notice here, this is still as Bowditch had designed it. You have these little roads that kind of meander through here. Next slide, please. Here they are. Okay, you have OP and MJ. Next slide, please. And by 1909, they tried their best to develop some of this land north here along Fairmont, and they turned their sights to Shaker Heights, to the sort of more village. Notice this says Cleveland Heights Village. There's the deeds of that time. Some say Cleveland Heights, some say Shaker Heights. The names of the roads are changing. Everything is sort of changing. But one thing that they do is they make actually Coventry into a real boulevard as it comes across here with a median strip, and they bring it through here, and they bring Coventry all the way through here. Coventry, this is today's Shaker, okay? But this is the way they had first devised it. And they really wanted to create, the very first parcels along here are the park frontage. One of the reasons why this is so important about the park frontage is that if Shaker Heights has a real heart, it really is the park, because the very first development was made with the park in mind. The park came first. The most important, the largest houses, the model homes were built up around the park. Everything faces the park. And so much of the interaction has to do with the park and later the rapid transit. It's almost a virtual town square. Next slide, please. And of course, in so much of their advertising material, they put the park and the lakes front and center. Next slide. Again, you know, and there's only 1 or 2 houses in this. There were very few at this point in time. Next slide. Their deed restrictions at this point and their architectural restrictions were much looser. They had to approve plans, but they weren't nearly as codified, so you see a greater range of architectural styles early on. Next slide. And they, of course, sold this idea of Shaker Heights, you know, pie in the sky, you know, with a terminal tower and connect to the city. This is by an artist named Rolf Stoll, a really wonderful Cleveland artist who is from Germany originally, but they're, you know, it's fairy tale castle land, clearly. Next slide. And peaceful people may not live longer in Shaker Heights, but they live better. Next slide, please. So, by 1922, this is the plan they had developed, and they selling more because by 1920 is when they really had their rapid transit system in place. To give you some idea of the settling of Shaker Heights, I find these figures to be absolutely amazing. In 1913, there were 200 people living in Shaker Heights. By 1919, there were 1,700. By 1931, there were 17,783. I mean, just amazing in terms of the growth. So the rapid transit, the full plan, really come into fruition. Next slide, please. So then now that you have this plan, more people can move in and build their houses. I don't have a date for this, but this is Marshall Lake. Find it interesting, you see that South Woodland that goes along the top of Marshall Lake. You can see actually how few houses there are there, how many blank spaces, so to speak, and again, how little all the trees are. Next slide. This is from 1922. I do have a date here. This is Upper Shaker Lake. And again, on the bottom is Shaker Boulevard, which would have been pretty much brand new as a boulevard at that time. The Rapid would have been brand new. But again, just a few houses off of some of those side streets. Next slide. And again, this is what Shaker Heights pretty much developed into. Like any other suburb, you know, little trees, light on landscaping, lots of houses. Next slide, please. Recreation. Okay, at this point, Shaker Heights was really primed to be a great spot for recreation. Next slide. Or the Shaker Lakes and the Shaker Park area. Again, part of their promotional Peaceful Shaker, their ways of pleasantness and their paths are of peace, and children play and recreate wonderfully in this Shaker-inspired community. Next slide, please. And so this is Lower Shaker Lake. And again, where lots of people did boat. Next slide. You've probably seen this image as well, back in the Lily Pond, which also was apparently a great place for skating, only about 2 feet deep in this spot. Next slide. And then you had this canoe club and the platform on the left. In terms of Shaker Heights recreation, people actually swam there pretty regularly until about 1920 is when accounts say that the lakes got to be a little bit too murky for that. There certainly was boating, sailing, and canoeing. Skating, Shaker Heights, the city of Shaker Heights would even put a red flag up if the ice was too thin. Lots of reports of people sort of cracking through the ice, drowning, as there always is. There was lots of cross country. There was even a deer park in the land that's directly to the east of Upper Shaker Lake. You know, there's kind of that wooded area. One of the first residents of Shaker Heights, Kenyon Painter, was did a lot of hunting, and actually imported deer from one of his hunting trips and let them loose in Shaker Heights. So there would be deer in the woods over there. Here, on this lake, on the north end, in the 19s and 20s, the city of Cleveland, in fact, actually, because the city of Cleveland owns this land, had a refreshment stand. They had a boathouse as well, and you could rent rowboats and canoes. For the more exclusive membership was at the Canoe Club, which began in 1908. They built that house that you see there in 1912. And it really was quite the place. Next slide, please. Here we have, it filled to the gills for one of its regattas. It had several regattas. It had parties all year long. It really was quite a happening place. I guess it was pretty typical to have moonlight races and in the 20s and 30s, and you'd take your radio out on the canoe and you'd go with your sweetheart for a little, drive around the lake. There was skinny dipping that reportedly went on. So, really quite interesting sorts of things. Next slide. This is one of the novelty races where they're standing up in their canoe. They also apparently did submarine races where they turned their canoe upside down and you'd use like the space as air to breathe as you went across the lake itself. Next slide. This is, I'm afraid, not a very good picture of the interior, but one of the very few that we have. And there's an inset with a huge fireplace, large couches on either side. You see some people sitting and some very interesting decorations along the walls. The next slide. These are all pretty much from the 20s. Here you have, this is a New Year's party at the Canoe Club. People would actually even do things like spend a month in the canoe club. They called it like camp for adults. And they'd hang out, and it must have been quite an enjoyable place. Party Central. Next slide. Other ways in which people sort of interacted with the lake were through memorializations and plantings. You're probably all familiar with the Victory Oaks, along Liberty Road, where Liberty Boulevard gets its name. After World War I, between 1918 and 1920, they planted approximately 850 oak trees all along North Park that went all the way from Lake Erie all the way up to Upper Horseshoe Lake. On the base of each of these, they had a bronze plaque, like you see on the left. And each one was inscribed with the name of a fallen soldier and the date he died. They are, you see here, bronze plaques, $10 each. The sculptor is Frank Girosh, who was also responsible for many of the sculptures all along the Cleveland Cultural Gardens as well. Several of these bronze plaques still are there, but many have been, they're on little concrete stubs. I don't know if you see little flags around as well. Unfortunately, a lot of them have disappeared over the years. But we do have a complete list of all the soldiers who originally had plaques there. Next slide, please. Other memorializations and kind of intrusions. This was a wildflower garden, sort of a memorial to the Shakers, that was created by the Shaker Lakes Garden Club in the 20s. This is in the foundations, actually, of that old Shaker mill, that sawmill that you saw earlier. And if you'll notice, do you see the bench, the stone bench that's up there? There's one on the other side as well. That was actually put in by a woman, Mrs. Rogers. She paid $700 out of her own money to have those little stone benches there, and she called it her cloister. She had a sundial there and spent quite a bit of time. There was wildflower plantings. They actually had a concealed pipe pump in water all around and had a lily pad there as well, a lily pond throughout, again, the old foundations. Next slide.
Where is that located, please?
That's on the corner of North Park and Coventry.
Okay, so that's visible still, that bench?
Yes, yes, absolutely. You can go down there. I was down there just about a week ago. And yes, you can still go down, you can see the foundations and the bench. Water's not there anymore, so.
It'll be adjacent to where the sawmill is.
Yep, right where the sawmill. That is the foundations of the sawmill, so absolutely, absolutely. There was even, I guess, in the Wildflower Garden, this sculpture. I don't have an exact title. The sort of nickname was Bird Lady. Again, by Frank Girosh. Apparently, the Cleveland Museum of Art has this in their collection, although I couldn't find it online. It was transferred there in 1939. But there was a sculpture there as well. Next slide.
Isn't it in the culture of the gardens in front of the Cleveland Museum of Art?
Does anyone know? Is it? They moved it to the gardens themselves?
Wind chasing spring, I think. I'm not sure this is.
Yeah.
That is a Hugo Shaw stuff, that wind chasing spring.
Next slide, please. At the same time, they actually commissioned this bridge to be built too. There's that little footbridge that's down there in that same little area. And again, this was one of the garden clubs. There are approximately 40 garden clubs that contributed to the beautification of Shaker Parks. And these are garden clubs who had members from all the different communities around. They really have contributed significantly to the landscape around Shaker Lakes over the years. Next slide, please. To sort of coordinate the efforts of all the garden clubs, they actually had a plan drawn up in the early 30s, a landscape plan, and here you have the architects Pitkin and Mott for plantings at least along Hampton Lake or Upper Shaker Lake. And you see Lee Road to the left. You see where there should have been a bridle trail. There were quite a few horses around at the time. There were even Shaker Heights police actually, had horses as well and paraded the area through horses. But this is just, you see along the North Park, you have the oaks themselves, the Victory Oaks. Next slide. And then this is the park itself. And the garden clubs got together, at least about 7 of them, and sort of divvied up who would take care of what. Along the south area, the Village Garden Club sort of took stewardship of that area. Shaker Lakes Garden Club took care of the point, so to speak, and then other garden clubs, the other areas around. Next slide, please. This is a view to the point, and if you look at the orange and the kind of reddish trees and plantings, those are the direct result of the Shaker Lakes Garden Club. That's all stuff that they had put in. Next slide. This is the Village Garden Club. In 1930, they are planting an orchard, so to speak. They're planting fruit trees. Next slide. And here is the results of their planting on the left and on the right. They started off, in fact, by planting 50 cherry trees. This was a result in part of a conversation between A.D. Taylor and Mrs. George Marshall at an intermission when the Metropolitan Opera was in town, and they were chatting, and one of the ways to beautify Shaker Lakes would be to do this kind of planting. They wanted to sort of mimic the cherry trees in Washington, D.C. They went so far as to write the Japanese ambassador to tell them what they were doing in hopes that he would come to Cleveland and visit. And they listed all the various trees they planted, and they have planted in excess of 200 trees over the years. They still continue to do this, by the way, every year plant a fruit tree, and again have added significantly to the park itself. All of this information, by the way, was compiled as a direct result of the freeway fight. I'll get to that a little bit more, but we have so much of this because everyone was trying to prove how important the lakes were for, again, Porter and other people who wanted to put the freeway through our communities. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is part of that too. See how people enjoy the lake. But I think it's interesting to see all the sailboats, to see the fishing. There's even reports of Frank Myers, who used to live in the house that we occupy, even trapped a muskrat. That was, of course, there was a taxidermy badge for Boy Scouts. Okay, so he did that. He gave his mom the pelts, which she actually then ended up using, which I find to be just totally incredible. But in any case, it really was, I think, more heavily used in that sense. Frank was quite the naturalist and talks about bluegill, sunfish, rock bass, and carp. There were tons of frogs, lists of birds, over 140 different birds. This is from about the 60s. Frank also hunted pheasants, rabbits, and bobwhites throughout the Shaker parks. So again, really just a huge usage of the lakes and the parks. Next slide, please. The Clark and Lee freeways. This, again, next slide, please, as you know, really rallied the community together and got them to really, I think, understand the importance of their lakes in a way that perhaps they hadn't thought of so concretely. You've probably all pretty much seen this. The Lee Freeway would go along pretty much Lee Road, cut straight through, go to 480, and then the Clark Freeway you see in the center. The interchange, next slide, please. What you see about there would occupy approximately 60 acres of land. I'm going to show you a series of aerial photographs. These were actually produced at the time that this controversy came up. They were copied and they were distributed to community groups to educate people about what was going on, so they would write letters and protest and that kind of thing. This is the freeway simply superimposed over the existing land. Clearly the freeway would have taken out a lot of land around what you see. So it really, I've been trying to calculate, I think the freeway probably would have taken out even the Tremaine Gallagher house, or at least it would have been almost directly next to it, so, okay, so this is essentially Lee going north-south, and you can see Lower Shaker Lake to the left. Next slide, please. Here it continues east, directly over Upper Shaker Lake, through what would be Deer Park, and kind of continues on, next slide, and then goes over to Shaker Boulevard and would go out. Next slide, please. This was announced in December of 1963. And immediately, next slide, please. Here you have the mayor of Shaker Heights, Paul Jones, getting on the phone, getting the committee together. And the first group to really sort of jump was the Citizens Freeway Committee. They even developed a logo, which you see on the right, cars on the scale on one side, greenery on the left. And they really took the charge early on. They went to Washington, and next slide, please. They met, here's the contingency that went to Washington, and by the way, Mayor Kenneth Nash was on this committee as well. So it was really a group of lawyers and people from both Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights. Next slide, please. They went to Washington and they met with the man on the right, Rex Whitten, who was the Federal Highway Administrator at the time. And it is, on the left you see Rex, his wife on the left, and Lady Bird Johnson on the right. The Shaker Heights case, because they spoke to Rex, I've actually found a newspaper article and some other documentation that says that it directly led to the Highway Act of 1966 that really made it incredibly difficult to build highways through parks and historic districts, historic areas. Now this was effective as of 1968, so there was a lot of wrangling that had to go on for the Shaker Heights case, but this Shaker Heights case really, and Cleveland Heights, the Shaker Lakes case, I should say, and the Clark Freeway case, really helped to make federal law, so to speak, and federal policy. This Citizen Freeway Committee was one of the first, but not by no means the early to really jump to the fight. Next slide, please. Here you have Elizabeth Nord. She's 83 at the time. She was the curator of the Shaker Historical Society. She's here in front of Stouffer's on Shaker Square collecting 3,000 signatures. Next slide. That were joined with many others, and 17,000 were presented to Governor Rhodes, who you see on the left. There's the envelope, and they even brought a whole Boy Scout troop to bring them along. Jim Goldsmith is on the far right, who's on our board today. That's his father. And apparently I asked him, oh, that must have been quite an honor, and your father must have been thrilled to go. And he said, well, I just kind of actually told my father a few days before you were picked to drive to Columbus. And, all he remembers is his father was really, really mad at him for that. But in any case, that was actually very effective. And the initial threat of the freeway was slowed by May 1964. Governor Rhodes postponed it pending the completion of the 7-county transportation land use study. This big, major study that was going to determine if you actually needed the freeway or not. The next threat came, next slide please. This is also in Heinens. They had this huge board where they had another freeway model. The next threat came early in '65 when they were going to do the Lee stub off 480. And they really felt, a totally different group of people felt, we can't have this stub built. If they do, they'll build the Lee Freeway and then it'll be over. They were successful actually in stopping that as well by August of '65. Soon after that, both Cleveland Heights preceded Shaker Heights by a month. They both had transportation advisory committees to sort of stay on top of things. And the threat was there, but again, really peaked in '69. Next slide, please. When Porter actually got NOACA to sort of bless the Clark and Lee Freeway, which was a real shock and a real surprise. And then all of a sudden in 1970, as you all know, Governor Rhodes declared it a dead issue. He was running for the Senate. He needed all the support he could get. And that was pretty much that. In 1971, the Nature Center, which was started in '66, right at the spot of the interchange, in '71 it was declared a National Environmental Education Landmark. And in 1974, the whole Shaker Lakes Park, again, as a result of this, was declared or put on the National Register of Historic Places for the Shaker background. See, both the Historical Society and all of these garden groups were trying to work either end. They didn't care. We'll stop the freeway for environmental reasons, we'll stop it for historical reasons, we don't care, but that's our angle, that's our strategy. And they both ended up yielding quite a bit of material and interest in history and interest in the environment, both in the way of the Nature Center, and actually the Historical Center is where it is in part because of this freeway fight. This cartoon, the next is a detail, this is from '69, gives an idea of all the players. You have Paul Jones here, Historical Society has a blast over here. Here you have these little ladies in tennis shoes. The garden club digs in against the freeway. And then the mean bad Albert Porter. I think it's always useful to remember Porter's words. He actually said the Shaker Lakes will not be destroyed by the construction of the Clark Freeway. They will be improved and retained on either side of the freeway, not only as lakes, but as retention basins to prevent flooding. He also said very succinctly that the bird sanctuary will not be affected. In fact, he goes on, roads enhance parks. He cited Gordon Park as an example. Look what I-90 did for Gordon Park. It improved it. You know, what could be more logical? And as you probably all know, Porter was later arrested for graft. And in any case, you know the rest of the story. Next slide, please. Shaker Lakes today, just a little capper. Next slide. Nature Center, we all know. Next slide. Next slide. It's interesting, you see how shallow this lake is. The upper Horseshoe Lake, for instance, when it was first completed, was 26 feet. It's 6 feet today in its deepest. That's why there are no more boats, in fact, because of the muddy. They're man-made lakes. The silting is part of a very natural kind of thing. Next slide, please. And, you know, today this stewardship, this sort of relationship between people and the Shaker Lake still continues. How many of you have seen the new asphalt path around Horseshoe Lake? That's within the last couple weeks. They haven't even finished the construction. This is the master plan. A lesser plan has been approved, but on the left you can see the trails. And they have redone sort of the picnic area and the playground with sort of more naturally sympathetic kinds of park equipment. But this is going on as we speak. And again, it's the future is very much up in the air. It'll be really interesting once this dredging issue comes to a head and who will pay for it. Typically, Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, but they've both paid for the maintenance, even though the city owns it. The current lease goes to 2090. Shaker Heights pays $1 a year. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, again, as the silting problem gets more and more serious, what will happen. But in any case, if there was any way to measure the amount of human interaction per surface of lakes, per time they've been in existence, which is relatively short, these Shaker Lakes must rank very high in the history of bodies of water. They are so natural and yet thoroughly man-made and thoroughly manipulated, but very much, I think, to improve the quality of life in the area. So that's all I have. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Stone Brook used for fishing, and is it today?
Just repeat the question.
Is Donebrook used for fishing, and is it today? I don't know of any fishing. Do any of you? I mean, perhaps I've never seen any fishing in Donebrook.
Down by the beginning of Martin Luther King goes into the park, cultural gardens, people fish on the lagoon, but it's not.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely are carp there today, but I don't know what else.
I have two questions.
Yes.
First one concerns Albert Porter.
Yes.
We're all big fans of Albert Porter.
Yes.
Coincidentally, also referred to Shaker Lakes as a two-bit duck pond.
Absolutely.
Where did he reside? Where did he live? Do you know? I'm sure it wasn't Shaker Heights.
controversy when this whole freeway thing came up because he actually owned property sort of further east, kind of like Pepper Pike, where the freeway would kind of let out. And so it would give him more direct access. So there was some argument made that, you know, this freeway may very much benefit him. I don't mean to be an Albert Porter defender, but I will say if you do look at a map of Cleveland and if you believe in this sort of perfect grid system of highways throughout the country for civil defense purposes, there is this great big gaping hole right where the heights are. And it's, if you like neat grids, I mean, it clearly is a gap if the freeway system is the thing that you look to the most. You know, there is this sort of almost incomplete. Now, I think it's great that way, even if it's a little extra inconvenience for some of us at times. But people have said that, some people have said that no, he wouldn't really benefit and that his real interest was sort of from an engineering highway point of view, you know. So I'm just throwing it out there as a possible argument.
I'm also curious, where specifically was the canoe club facility located?
The canoe club facility, you know where the big pile of mulch is on the southern part of Lower Shaker Lake? It's there. It was right around there. And it was torn down in '76 mostly because of it couldn't connect to the city of Cleveland's sewers, and it had fallen in disrepair. It certainly had fallen out of use and had been empty for a long time, and it was quite a hazard. But that's where it was. Really large facility. They tried to save it, actually, or look into the possibility of saving it, but it just was, I guess, beyond that at that point.
Why are the lakes no longer used for skating and boating like it was years ago?
Boating has a lot to do with lake levels, as I understand it, and maybe Jan might even know more about this, but I think it has more to do, and apparently if you fall in as well, with the muck on the bottom, it's not nearly as safe as it could be. They also are just, because they're so shallow, they are dirtier. I don't know if that has much to do with it. Skating, I don't know. Of course, when was the last time we've had enough of a freeze to, have a good skate? Skating at times in the past had been prohibited simply because people fell through. So I don't even know if there's an ordinance or not.
Have the lakes been artificially lowered? Because you said at one time they were 6 feet deep.
No, it's all from the bottom up. The surface from pictures and from people who have lived their whole lives, the surface hasn't changed dramatically, the surface shape itself. It's all the silting coming up from underneath. It's really nature trying to revert back to what it was in the first place.
Sure. I have a question. How just in that time period did they dig big lakes that were 6 feet?
I don't know. Well, first of all, it was more of a valley. I mean, there was some of the natural, but they had to clear there's these accounts of clearing all the trees, that were alongside. They had to hack them all down. They had these big fires. They burned it, It was an earthen dam. And they did have some other, James Prescott was a mason, but they also had other people from other Shaker communities who were experts in their fields come and advise them on the how-to. But basically, they just did it, they just muscled it through.
You wouldn't have to dig the hole, it was a valley. You just
Right.
put the dam up across one end.
Yeah. But it had to have been a much more dramatic valley at that time.
Well, if you go out the other branch of Gum Creek at Shaker Country Club, you've got at least a 26-foot drop down of the fairways to the golf course.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes.
What is the name of the lake behind the houses on South Woodland Road?
Names of the lakes behind the houses on South Woodland. The lake to the east is Marshall Lake. To the east is Green Lake, and to the west is Marshall.
I see.
And again, those are both created in 1911.
You mentioned the Marshall House on Lee that was being rented. Where exactly?
It's on the corner of Lee and South Woodland. And there are two twin houses that are joined in the center. And apparently construction will be completed, maybe what? It was supposed to be completed this summer, maybe in the next 6 months or so. Hard to say, but can't wait to see it.
There are actually 4 houses there. There's a house that was
That's right.
a carriage house, and that's on South Woodland. And then there's the 2 houses on the one that faces the corner of Lee and South Woodland, and then the main house. And then around the corner on the front one, there's a 4th house. So it's a compound, and I think they were built for the family. And the question about why people aren't allowed to fish and swim and boat and all, I always was told it was liability issues.
Yeah, that makes.
I think that's just the information that I always.
Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have a guide available to sort of do a self-guided tour of the various structures that remain, foundations and things of that sort?
It's in the works.
Good, yeah.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.